Government is facing a debt ceiling uh, problem with $34 trillion of national debt. The government needs to have the constitutional right to print money debt free to provide universal health care and retirement pension, social security for people with retirement age and disabilities. The problem that the government currently faces is that the government, in order to pay for these social programs, they have to ask the Treasury Department to print IOUs in forms of Treasury bills and security bonds to sell it to the Federal Reserve, and then the Federal Reserve takes and prints money out of thin air and gives it to America, but with interest. And those security bonds and treasury bills starts to be speculative stock exchange and in the open markets in Wall Street. So that adds to the interest payments that the government has to derive through the IRS and pay back to the Federal Reserve. So in order to avoid all of the government debt obligations crippling the nation and destroying our economy, America has to have the constitutional right. The government has to have the constitutional right to be able to print money debt free in order to provide universal health free universal health care to all American citizens and the safety net of retirement pension plan through Social Security as far as retirees and people with disabilities. If the government can print money without having to go through the Treasury Department and beg the Federal Reserve to loan America money, because right now the way it exists, if you go to the hospital and you go to the emergency room, that's like 50,000, 60,000, and then even to get a Band-Aid in the emergency room will cost you like $500. So at the end of the day, uh, it's unpayable. The government doesn't know how to derive enough brackets or derivatives through the IRS to be able to tax its way out of it. $34 trillion of its debt obligations. And the majority of that is because of health care and Social Security. Because the government has to beg the Federal Reserve to print money out of thin air for interest that the government has to pay it back in interest. And the Federal Reserve takes all those speculative treasury bonds and security IOUs and starts to sell it in the open markets. So to investors. And so investors start to invest in it, and then America has to pay the interest of those stock exchange, but the Federal Reserve was able to print it out of thin air. It ain't cost nothing for the Federal Reserve to print currency out of thin air. But America's on the hook for interest, unpayable interest. And so it's bankrupting this nation. The Federal Reserve is necessary to have free capitalism of the private sector. But there should be a division between government programs and the private sector, especially when it comes to health care. The government should have the constitutional right not to have to go beg the Federal Reserve to print money. The government should have the constitutional right to print money on its own. To have the ability to print as much money as it needs to provide universal health care, free universal health care to all American citizens. And also print money debt free to pay for retiree Social Security and people with disabilities. At the end of the day, if the government can bypass the Federal Reserve and not have to print IOUs through the Treasury Department in order to beg the Federal Reserve to print money out of thin air for interest payments, that once it's speculated with stocks in the stock exchange, that drives up the leverage that America has to pay back in interest payments. The prices are so outrageous that that the pharmaceutical industries, the hospitals, all that through the free markets, it overwhelms the taxpayers because the Federal Reserve leverages it in the speculative stock exchange to leverage it for the highest returns, which those highest returns America has to pay with interest. So if America can bypass ever having to go to the Federal Reserve to beg for IOUs, give me a second. Where was I? Got interrupted. All right, so if America, you know how they're supposed to have separation of church and state because America is has different citizens that have beliefs in different religions. So there's supposed to be a separation between church and state in order to respect everybody' beliefs and their own beliefs in whatever religion they decide to believe in. That the government shouldn't impose a religion on every citizen. That there's supposed to be a separation between church and state in order to respect people's faith or lack of faith or faith, whatever people decide to believe in. So, what I believe is that there's supposed to also be a separation between the private sector and the governmental sector when it comes to governmental social programs. When it comes to governmental social programs, that's supposed to be the sole prerogative of the government, not the private sector. It's supposed to be the government's sole constitutional prerogative to provide every American with free universal health care for every American and with a safety social retirement plan for their citizens when they get to reach the retirement age or people with disabilities. So if the government bypasses the Federal Reserve constitutionally, if the government doesn't have to print IOU treasury bills and security bonds to the Treasury Department and ask the Secretary of the Treasury to beg the Federal Reserve chairman to print IOU money out of thin air. Because think about it, the Federal Reserve prints it out of thin air. It doesn't. They print money out of thin air, but they sell it to the government for for interest, unpayable interest. So that's why the government keeps on digging itself a deeper hole in the debt ceiling. And they're afraid to raise the debt ceiling anymore because they don't know how to tax their way out of it. So in order to avoid the government becoming bankrupt when it comes to providing social safety nets, America should have the constitutional right to print money out of thin air, debt free, that they don't have to go to the Treasury Department and beg the Federal Reserve for IOUs. What the government can do is print money out of debt free out of thin air and bypass the Federal Reserve and have the constitutional right, the government, to, like I said, mint the currency, print the currency for the budgets of the fiscal budgets of their health needs for their nation population, as well as their retirement retirees budgets for Social Security and Social SSI and Social SSD insurance for people with disabilities. So at the end of the day, if the government can print money without having to pay interest on it, then the government won't be worrying about bankrupting itself when it comes to forcing the IRS to come up with different derivatives the way it's doing now in order to pay the Federal Reserve for health care and because the government gets indebted to the Federal Reserve for through the Treasury Department to pay for our healthcare industries and our welfare programs for healthcare, which is bankrupting the nation, and also is bankrupting the nation because they got to beg the Federal Reserve for interest loans for Social Security payments and healthcare. So that's is when the Federal Reserve takes those IOUs from the Treasury Department and then they bid them up in the open markets in New York and the New York Stock Exchange. That's what affects the interest payments of the government, and it just accumulates so fast that the IRS, it's impossible for the IRS to create enough derivatives to tax its way out of it. That's why America has a debt obligations of $34 trillion and growing, because we are sabotaging ourselves as far as the government, having to force the Treasury Secretary to print IOUs as in forms of security bonds and Treasury bills to give it to the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, all they do is print it out of thin air. But they sell it to the government for 10% interest, or whatever the going rate of APR rate for that particular business cycle. And then when they talk these stocks up in Wall Street, that's when the pharmaceuticals starts to expand the prices of medicine, or the prices of hospitals. So all of that puts too much pressure of leverage on the government debt obligations to pay this interest that is rapidly inflating. Interest is growing and growing and growing by the milliseconds. The government's printing so much money by the milliseconds that yearly we spend $2 or $3 or $4, $5 trillion and growing every year. And the government is impossible to create enough tax brackets to derive this much payment to pay for the interest. And it's going to forsake the government's AAA rating. And the government, once they don't know how to raise the debt ceiling anymore because they can't tax their way out of it, that's when they have a run on the banks, because the government will credit rating from AAA will be downgraded to single A status. So for that reason, I propose my amendment proposes that the government should have a separation between government and the free markets when it comes to healthcare and Social Security. That the government shouldn't have to go through the Treasury Department to print IOUs and Treasury bonds to beg the Federal Reserve for money when it comes to these two social programs. It should be hands off when it comes to the Federal Reserve. In other words, the government should have to beg in all fours, beg for money from the private sector. It shouldn't have to be that way. The government should have the constitutional right to print its budgetary money for the year to supply the money supply for free universal health care for all American citizens and Social Security retirement. Because at the end of the day, if the government can print the money debt free, then they don't have to worry about taxing their way out of it. They won't have to worry about taxing their way out of it, because there won't be no debt to tax for when it comes to printing money out of thin air. If the government has the constitutional right to separate those obligations, those government budget obligations, separated from the Federal Reserve, then the government doesn't have to pay interest on it. And if the government doesn't have to pay interest on it, then it's debt free, because we don't have to pay the private sector bankers for it. At the end of the day, that money is allocated constitutionally debt free, that the government can coin that money or print that currency to supply every American with free access to universal health care and Social Security. And the government doesn't have to pay a penny of it in interest or debt repayments. The government doesn't have to worry about it because it's printing money for that purpose debt free. And that's how America won't have to argue every year. Congress won't have to argue about raising the debt ceiling, because we're digging ourselves into a hole. Where we're doing it now by the government, Congress, issuing a budget and then insisting that the Treasury Secretary prints IOUs and security bonds and Treasury bills to go over to the Federal Reserve, which is private bankers. The Federal Reserves are our cartel of bankers. And the government is begging the private sector, cartel, Federal Reserves, bankers, to print money that they do for debt free. The bankers, they print it out of thin air, but they lend it to the government with interest obligations. And that's where the trap lies. That's where the government is falling for the trap. That the government is making is digging itself into a hole. Is burying itself into a hole. And is suffocating itself by burying itself in a hole. In a financial debt hole. Obligations. The way the Federal Reserve is lending America outrageous interest payments for printing money out of thin air to lend it for America can pay its health care, welfare insurance, and Social Security. But if the government separates that obligation from the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve has its place in the private sector for private businesses and private industries. But when it comes to health care funding and Social Security funding, the government should separate it from the Federal Reserve and not allow the Federal Reserve to be involved. The Federal Reserve shouldn't be involved when it comes to health care, printing money to supply for the budgets of paying for health care and Social Security. That should be constitutionally the responsibility of the government to supply those funds debt-free. So the IRS doesn't have to tax a penny of it in order to pay it back, because it's debt-free to the government. It doesn't cost the government nothing to print that currency to supply for that to pay for that universal health care and to pay for that Social Security benefit. Because it should be their constitutional obligation, not the Federal Reserve's obligation, but the government obligation to print that money debt-free. So there should, for this purpose, be a separation between government and the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, like I said, they have their place in free commerce. The Federal Reserve are private bankers and private businesses and Wall Street. They have their places. They have their reasons for existing. When it comes to economics, they have their reasons for existing. But there should be a fine line of separation between not only church and state, but also when it comes to the health care and Social Security, there should be a separation between government and the Federal Reserve. There should be a separation. In other words, the government doesn't have to go and beg the Federal Reserve to print money for interest, for the government can pay for health care or Social Security. The government can have the constitutional right to print money out of thin air, the same currency, print it out of thin air, without having a penny of it to be paid back in form of interest or debt obligations of loan interest. In other words, let's say the healthcare budget for 1 year is let's say is $9 billion for 1 year to supply free universal funding for free universal healthcare for every American citizen for that particular year. So the government can print $900 billion and not worry about having to pay a penny of it back in interest or pay it to anybody else. In other words, you print the $9 billion and that's to take care for the free universal health care payments for the pharmaceuticals and the health industries and the hospitals and the universities, the medical universities. Whatever it's the budget for that year, the government can print that budget out of thin air, debt free. meaning the government doesn't have to tax a penny of it. They don't have to tax a penny of it when it comes to the American population. The same for Social Security. The government doesn't have to tax a penny of it in order to provide retiree pension plans for Social Securities. If the government prints the money, budgetary money for that particular fiscal year, the government prints it and that's it. They don't have to worry about taxing their way out of it, or paying interest payments on it, or debt payments on it. In other words, the government prints it and allocates it, and never had to worry about paying a penny of it back like they're doing through the Federal Reserve, because the government is burying itself in debt when it comes to the Federal Reserve, when it comes to this particular social safety nets. And so the government, you got to understand, the Federal Reserve prints it out of thin air, but they milk the shit out of the government. They milk the shit out of the government. The Federal Reserve takes the government's pants down and fucks the shit out of the government. You know? Like if the government was a whore, the Federal Reserve rapes it. For the love of greed. For the love of greed. The Federal Reserve pillages and plunders the government taxpayers with IOUs. They pillage and plunder the government with leveraging the government in debt obligations. The Federal Reserve does when it comes to these treasury bills and security bonds. So at the end of the day, there should be a separation between the free sector capitalism and the Federal Reserve and the private bankers. They can have that when it comes to regular industries, but when it comes to providing for the money supply of Social Security and healthcare, that's supposed to be separated and debt-free, and the government should have the sovereign right to print the sovereign money debt-free, so the government doesn't have to tax a penny. When it comes to the American population, the government doesn't have to tax any citizen, not even a penny, to pay for health care or Social Security. And the government every year doesn't have to worry about not even $1 of interest debt payments, because the government can print whatever budgetary money it will take to fund universal health care for that fiscal year and universal Social Security retiree pension payments for that particular fiscal year. Once the government prints that money, that year is done, and the government doesn't have to worry about not even a penny of it in interest, or not even a penny of it being taxed on the American population. So, if the government does this, we will survive as a better society. We will survive as a better society. You're still going to have the private sector. The private sector is there to stimulate the markets, the industries, the corporations, the private sector will still be there, and the banking systems will still be there. But that's for the private sector, as far as buying cars, televisions, smart gadgets, clothes, food, and all types of different industries, production industries, and commodity goods sectors, and providers of these mercantile industries and free markets. That will always be there and the Federal Reserve will have its place in the private sector. And the government will still tax businesses, to pay for highways, to pay for emergency responders like firemen, policemen. We will still tax our citizens for those particular budgets. But when it comes to health care, which is the biggest debt burden of the American government, and Social Security payments, the government should print that out of thin air. The government shouldn't have to beg the Federal Reserve. The government shouldn't have to send the Secretary of the Treasury to the Federal Reserve to beg for the budgets to pay for health care or Social Security. The government should have the constitutional right to print that money and bypass the Federal Reserve. The government should bypass it and print the money debt-free that the government doesn't have to tax an American citizen, not even a penny, to provide that type of safety net for health care and Social Security. If the government does this, we would, as far as the Congress is concerned, the purse strings of the Congress, they will alleviate crippling this nation economically. Because the way we're headed now, the government is burying itself and suffocating itself and is about to shatter the debt ceiling and bankrupt the nation. The way we're going about it by becoming prostituted by the Federal Reserve for debt obligations through the Treasury Department. We're basically raping ourselves, we're sodomizing ourselves and spazzing them out and causing ourselves to have a cardiac arrest by being stupid enough to ever gone to the Federal Reserve to beg for this much money, and then them prostituting us in the open markets. Meaning the government is deriving so much debt obligations that it doesn't know how to pay its way out of it, because they haven't to go through the Federal Reserve, which it shouldn't be that way. When it comes to the social programs of the government, as far as healthcare and Social Security, the government should print money that is debt free for those purposes of healthcare, free universal healthcare and Social Security. If they do this, the government will have a much easier time controlling its fiscal budget yearly, and the government won't have to worry about being bankrupt. So there's still a reason for the private sector and the Federal Reserve and the stock exchange and the Wall Street, but that's for everything else in the private sector. That's not for healthcare and Social Security. As far as paying for it, the government shouldn't have to beg the Federal Reserve, not even for a penny, when it comes to these issues. The government should have not to beg the Federal Reserve, not even for a penny, when it comes to this particular debt burden. The government should have the constitutional right to print money out of thin air and not worry about being indebted for it when it comes to the taxation of the American people. In other words, if the government doesn't have to tax for it, if the government can print money out of thin air for it, then the government is not indebted for it at the end of the day, like it is through the Federal Reserve and the way it currently exists, in order to supply the liquidity for these budgets, which is outrageous. So if Congress wises up and separates the obligations from the Federal Reserve, if they cut the umbilical cord, if the Congress cuts the umbilical cord of the purse strings, debt obligations for healthcare and Social Security away from the Federal Reserve, then the government would blossom in a new era and never have to worry about raising the debt ceiling when it comes to healthcare and Social Security, because there won't be no debt there to worry about as far as paying it through the Treasury Department when it comes to the Federal Reserve. The government shouldn't have to beg the Federal Reserve for any money, because the government should have the constitutional right to print whatever money to be allocated for that fiscal year for healthcare and Social Security, and not even have to worry about taxing the American people, not even a penny, because the government doesn't have to pay it back in interest payments. The government just can print whatever money it needs for whatever fiscal year when it comes to free healthcare for everybody and Social Security for retirees and people with disabilities. If the government has the ability to print it and not have to worry about paying it back, then there's no problem as far as fiscal debt of bankruptcy, the way the government is headed now with $34 trillion that the government doesn't know how to tax its way out of it. And a large portion of that $34 trillion has to do with the way the government is designed and functioning now. The current status of the government having to send the Treasury Secretary to beg the Federal Reserve for IOUs, Treasury Bill Security Bonds, to print billions of dollars that has so much interest that the government doesn't know how to tax its way out of it. It's ridiculous. The racket, the debt trap that the Federal Reserve sets for the government is ridiculous. The debt trap. The debt trap that the Federal Reserve sets for the government is ridiculous. And every fucking year, we're worrying about raising the debt ceiling. We're worrying about, oh, the government is going to forsake on its debt because we don't know how to create enough derivatives in the IRS to tax our way out of it. So at the end of the day, if the government doesn't have to worry about paying interest payments on it, and they can print the money debt-free, then there's no issue to be worried about when it comes to repayment. There's no debt obligations. So there's supposed to be a separation between government, constitutional government, budgetary money, debt-free, separate from the Federal Reserve, that the Federal Reserve doesn't have no jurisdiction over or no say-so over when it comes to these budgets. That constitutionally the government should have the right to supply these funds debt-free for its citizens. Of course, the Federal Reserve, I'm not saying dismantle this Federal Reserve and abolish it. No, because you got the private sector, you got Wall Street, you got capitalism, you got manufacturing, you got exports, imports, you got the open stock exchange for these private sector corporations. Yeah, that will still exist. That will still exist, and the IRS will still tax the private sectors to supply for the infrastructure of our nation and the first responders. But as far as healthcare and Social Security, that's the biggest burden, the financial burden that currently exists. If the government knows how to liberate its way out of it, how to break the shackles of financial enslavement, and have the constitutional freedom to print the money, that the government doesn't have to even tax a penny of it, because the government can print it out of thin air, every fiscal budget, to meet the needs of health care for every citizen and Social Security retirement for every citizen. So if the government knows how to do that debt-free, then the government will have a easier leeway to not worry about bankrupting ourselves as a nation, fiscal responsibilities, bankrupting ourselves, the way we're doing it currently with the Federal Reserve. Don't fall for that trap, because it's a financial trap that the government is falling for. And the Federal Reserve bankers are just raping and pillaging and plundering Congress. Well, every time it buys its treasury bills and IOUs, the Federal Reserve is digging their teeth like a pit bull, biting their asses and shaking every penny out of them to the tune of $34 trillion. So, in order to not be shaken down by cartel private bankers, constitutionally, the government should not have to go there when it comes to the Federal Reserve. The government shouldn't have to deal with them when it comes to printing money out of thin air for paying for health care and Social Security. So, I think this amendment is the right way that the government should coordinate itself to, and accord itself to constitutionally, to supply the money supply for healthcare and Social Security. And the government doesn't have to worry about even taxing a penny for it. Now, as far as the pharmaceutical industry goes, the medical universities, and the hospital, the hospital facilities, all of that will have to be set with price controls, government price controls. But they can still, the health industry, the universities, and the pharmaceuticals, they can still participate in the Wall Street stock exchange for market Wall Street investors. But the government has to be willing to control price controls, to not let it skyrocket, as far as balloon payments, as far as their stocks becoming too inflated that the government is printing too much money, and is it begins chasing bad money after good money. So to stop throwing, how they say, good money after bad money, in other words, for the government to prevent it from snowballing into balloon payments as far as quarterly budgets and yearly budgets, the government should have reasonable price controls, reasonable set prices for medications, for university tuitions, for doctors to go to college and to get their degrees. There should be uh, set price controls for the universities, for the hospitals, and for the pharmaceutical industries. That the government sets reasonable price controls, and these entities can still can still register in the stock markets for investors, but the investors will have a reasonable knowledge of how much to invest in these corporations, whether they be the pharmaceutical industries, whether it be the universities, whether it be the hospitals. There'll be reasonable price controls of the going rates universally uh, throughout the globe. Whatever medicines are going for, whatever hospital bills are going for, whatever college tuition degrees are going for, reasonable uh, applications of price controls to have the normal maiden pricing of the going rate globally. So, because the government, if the government doesn't set price controls for these sectors, then they will want to balloon their the prices of their commodities, whether it be the pharmaceuticals. If they know that the government is printing money out of thin air to pay for the pharmaceuticals, then the pharmaceuticals will want to charge a fortune for their pills. The same for the universities; they will want to charge the government a fortune for it. The same for uh, the hospitals owners; they will want to charge a inflated prices. So to keep these private sectors from inflating their prices too much, the government has to set reasonable price controls. I apologize. It was background noise. Um, People talking in the background. All right. So yeah, for the government to be able to keep prices at bay from overinflating, because if these private sectors like the pharmaceutical industry, the hospitals, the universities, if they know that they can charge the government whatever they can come up with as far as pricing, they will want to grow rich off the government, balloon themselves with gluttony when it comes to price setting. So the government has to keep the prices reasonably controlled with price check control brackets as far as what's the maiden going rate for globally for medicine, for university degrees, and for hospital oversight operations of running a hospital. So the government has to set reasonable price controls. But as far as these industries, they're free to go and open up stock exchange and be a public corporation and sell stocks in the open markets. They have the freedom to do that, but their stocks can only go but so high uh, because like I said, if these private industries, the pharmaceuticals, the industries, the universities, the hospitals, if they know that they can charge the government whatever price they can come up with, trust me, they'll come up with as steep of a balloon price as their greed desires. So yeah, the prices have to be kept in check and they have to be reasonably controlled by the going rate globally. Um, so the fair pricings of the going rate for these industries has to be controlled by the government. Uh, uh, so these industries, they can sell their stocks, but their stocks can only go but so high. Uh, the going rate of these services has to be rationalized with the global prices for these particular commodities of pharmaceuticals, hospital operations, and governorship of hospitals, governance of hospitals, facilities, and as well as the universities tuitions to train nurses, doctors, and for them to get their degrees in universities. Because the government, when they print money out to pay for these services, the pricing has to be reasonable uh, compared to the maiden prices of the going rates globally for these type of services. But other than that, the government can print money out of thin air, debt free, to provide for universal health care and social security social safety nets that was set forth in the New Deal when Roosevelt came up with these safety nets. A society cannot function uh, with integrity if it's not providing universal health care for its citizens and a safety net of a retirement plan for people that can't work no more. For people that worked all their lives and reach an old age, they should have the right to enjoy the golden years of their life in retirement with Social Security. Uh, so, so if the government conducts itself in this particular a fashion of this proposal of this amendment that I am uh, the founder of this particular concept in ushering and insisting that the government uh, ratifies this type of policies, it will lead the nation off in a better society, because right now the middle class Americans are being taxed to pay for Obamacare, and they're being overtaxed to pay for universal health care for people that have low incomes. So that's a tax burden on the middle class. And then the government exacerbates that debt burden on the middle class by having to go to the Federal Reserve for IOUs. And then the IOUs are steeply taxed or with interest through the stock exchange, which bankrupt the government. And it leads us to the point that we are now with $34 trillion of debt. So for that to be avoided, the government should uh, should veer policies in the direction that I'm explaining. Uh, and like that, this way the government can alleviate the tax obligations off the middle class and offer the middle class as well as the lower class, the impoverished class populations, provide everybody with free and universal health care for everybody, debt free, so nobody has to pay for it. At the end of the day, it's a service that the government is providing free of charge. So for that reason, the Constitution should allow for it, because there's one thing that a society needs, and it's access to health care, free, in my opinion, free universal health care, and a safety net for people that worked all their lives, toiling away, blood, sweat, and tears, laboring away all their lives into the age of 60. And around that age, they have the right to retire in peace and never have to work a day in their lives after retirement. So for that reason, they should have access to Social Security. So if the government provides these safety nets, society will be better off than worse off, and the government can be more prosperous than burdened by the heavy, steep debt that is currently in its trajectory at current status of the present tense when it comes to how the government is functioning fiscally to provide for these services through the Federal Reserve. Something has to change, and the government should be able to pivot. The government should be able to pivot constitutionally and provide these services free of charge to anybody. Um, as far as being able to print the money to supply the funding for the budgets to provide for these services. So I don't want to be keep on being redundant and explaining with redundancy because I at this time I think y'all get the point. Uh, I don't gotta complicate it with rambling on with redundancy and keep on repeating myself. But at the end of the day, what the government uh, should do before it's too late. And also, the government will be able to tax these entities. So the government can tax the pharmaceuticals companies, the government can tax the universities, the government can tax the hospitals. So at the end of the day, the government nets a profit. At the end of the day, instead of netting debt, the government can net a profit because the government is printing this money debt free and paying it out to the hospitals, the pharmaceuticals, and the universities. So at the end of the day, when these entities they start to become private companies, public companies in the stock exchange, the government can tax them a business tax. Of course, the business tax has to be reasonable and preferably small as far as the percentile of tax brackets has to be reasonably kept small because the government doesn't want to put too much tax burdens on these industries. It's not good for business. So, but still, the government will net a profit instead of debt. So, when the government taxes business tax for the pharmaceutical industries, for the universities, and the hospital uh, organization, business owners that operates hospitals throughout the country, they will still get business taxed. But the government will tax them a reasonable bracket, small bracket percentile of business tax that won't infringe on their profitability. But at the end of the day, the government nets a profit, and that profit that the government nets can go towards paying for infrastructure or paying for first emergency responders, firefighters, and police departments, or pay for the budgets of the defense department, or the energy sectors that are funded with grants or tax incentives towards green energies. In other words, instead of being bankrupt when it comes to healthcare and Social Security, the government nets a profit off of the health industry instead of netting debt obligations.